Welcome to this session. I hope you've been enjoying your day so far. This session's on risk. Is this the real life or is it just fantasy? Some tips and tricks on how we do risk assessment better. I have with me in the audience here David Wenham, Holly Mulvihill-Clark, and Vicky Swain. Thank you for waving, David. That was appreciated. I'm David Tolson. I work for NEBOSH, so I'm the Director of Learning and Assessment. But I'd like the panel to introduce themselves. Over to you, Holly.
Hello, my name is Holly Mulvihill-Clark and I'm Head of Education at the International Institute of Risk and Safety Management. IIRSM is a membership organisation for those working in risk and safety. We recognise various NEBOSH qualifications for membership and launched a qualification, the Certificate in Managing Risk, in partnership with them earlier this year.
Good, excellent. Right. David, over to you.
Thank you. My name's David Wenham. I started my career as an HSE inspector many years ago. I've worked as a health and safety advisor in education, but for the last 30 years until I retired, I worked at Loughborough University in teaching on their postgraduate programme in health and safety management.
Good. And finally, Vicky.
Hello, my name's Vicky Swain. I'm Director at Free Safety. We are a fire health and safety consultancy based throughout the UK.
Excellent, good stuff. So we'll be on fire, Vicky. I'm sure you get that all the time. But that's it. Right, we'll dive straight into it. I mean, one of the things is keeping risk assessments and risk management real. And one of the questions we often see and the issues that we often see is how far should we go with risk assessment? And there's a number of things which probably occur to people. So maybe the first question is to you, David. Does an organisation's attitude to risk actually change things in terms of how they do risk assessment?
I'm sure it does. Obviously, some organisations take it very seriously,
yes,
and do try and risk assess everything. I guess many organisations, certainly small businesses, don't do anything at all, even though they should. And there's a big spectrum between those two. And I guess it should change things, because clearly if things aren't satisfactory, then it should highlight to the organisation that they need to do something about it. I see it as really taking just reasonable steps to ensure that they're managing the health and safety of their employees and others, and doing it in a sensible way. And clearly, depending on the size of the organisation, that can vary as to, and also clearly on the nature of the hazards. If you've got a nuclear power station, then risk is going to be risk is forefront in your minds. If you run a small business with few or negligible hazards, then clearly it isn't going to be have such an impact on you because of the nature of it. But there is clearly a big spectrum of attitude to it.
What do you think, Vicky?
I think organisations, so we get the spectrum of organisations, but actually all organisations have got, and we call it significant risks, don't we? We look for our significant findings. So that means we're not doing absolutely everything. We're not risk assessing everything, but you have to look for what is actually significant to the business, and that will change depending on who the business is. But of course, even the smaller businesses do have significant risks, and they need to be considering them as well. I mean, larger businesses tend to take on some risks because actually it's a business continuity issue, and then they want to manage it from that perspective as well to make sure that actually they can still deliver their services or products going forward.
And as David is mentioning, if you've got a nuclear power station, because everyone's got one in their gardens, of course, you'd be concentrating on specific risks due to that. And if you're a chemical company, if you're not concentrating on the chemical risks there and instead doing something else, then, you know, there's something wrong, isn't there? I mean, from a risk management perspective and overall, I guess you see this quite a lot, don't you, Holly? You know, this sort of what people concentrate on depends on the sector that they're in and the type of business.
Yeah, definitely. So, you know, on the organisational level, risk is the impact of uncertainty on objectives. So if an organisation is working, you know, it's a nuclear power station or construction, then it goes without saying, and health and safety is going to have much more importance in terms of the risks that the organisation faces as a whole compared to a small office-based organisation. But I think as well, when we talk about health and safety risks, we talk a lot about the threats that come from those. So there's obviously the moral reasons for managing health and safety, but the financial, legal and reputational as well. But an interesting one for me, I think, is around the wellbeing piece now, where organisations manage that risk in terms of the opportunity it can bring as well. And we know this is an increasingly important area to our members. We've recently run a survey with Deloitte and the Institute of Directors. And 50% of directors who responded said they actually felt it had a positive impact on business improvement. So I think that's kind of reframing perhaps how people view risk management and risk assessment in the broader arena of health and safety.
That is an interesting point, because oftentimes you can just see it as a negative thing, you know, managing negative things, you know, stopping bad things happening. But the reality is, as you pointed out, it's also an opportunity to manage as well. It's an interesting positive spin to it. I think going on to a related subject, I think sometimes you can see people worry a great deal and effectively turn it into just a paper exercise. So is it risk assessment essentially just a paper exercise, David, do you think, or is it more than that? In practice.
When you go around and look at risk assessments and they're pristine, filed nicely away, everything in order, then probably gives the indication that it is just a paper exercise for that particular organisation. But clearly it shouldn't be just seen as a bureaucratic event that you've got to do to satisfy your regulator. You've got, you know, it should be something positive for you to and reassure you that you are managing things reasonably. You know, you don't have to be perfect in this world, even though you might try, but you have to take reasonable steps, as we all know, in terms of what the law requires, and summarising those steps, having given some consideration, hopefully consulted with the workforce, because clearly implementing change and also using the workforce as a means of advising you on what are the significant risks, because the workforce are really they're going to be the experts in that particular organisation, rather than the safety manager or the managing director or whoever is going to be tasked with this job. And certainly if it's a consultant, then again, clearly they've got to be up to speed, because again, you can't just leave it to them. You know, it's the organisation, of course, that's a point to make, it has to own that and feel it's of some value. Otherwise, it just ends up being a pointless exercise that you're not going to be able to use to improve matters.
I think it is really interesting, actually. I was going to ask Vicky on this one as well, that sometimes you can see in a criticism that's sometimes levelled is that you almost you know, just you write the assessment to justify something that you've already decided that you're going to do, and then you make up the risk assessment to fit it to satisfy the regulator, which is obviously what you were saying about not doing. You're not doing it just to satisfy the regulator. You're actually doing it as a positive thing. Do you see that, Vicky? I mean, obviously you go around and you see lots of businesses.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, you try to go in and work with the workers, because actually if you've got them on board, we're much more likely then to get buy-in to the control measures. Most of the time people know that they've got to do something, but they don't really understand exactly why they've got to do it. And putting an overarching hazard in place, they go, well, it doesn't quite or telling them it's for health and safety reasons, it doesn't actually give them the substance that they need to understand it, and to actually, and then to be able to have their input come in to make it a live living document that actually they understand, they have been part of, and they agree with.
Because it's surprising, isn't it? Just saying to people, oh, you're doing this for health and safety reasons, you'd expect everyone to then comply, wouldn't you? But no, they want to know more. Yeah, I mean, it's not like a magic formula, but you're right. I think ultimately it's got to have an impact, hasn't it? The measures you put in place have got to reduce risk or maximize opportunities for your organization. They can't just be a piece of paper that you iron every now and again when the regulator comes in to make it look nice. Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's a really nice, high quality risk assessment. Really nice paper. Yeah, you've passed. No, it's got to actually be impactful. I think one of the things that people often struggle over is how detailed risk assessments have to be. And, we've all seen the 55-page risk assessment for holding the handrail or something in a business. So I mean, what would your advice be, David, on sort of how much complication and detail should be in there?
Well, difficult question because I think advice said a risk assessment should be proportionate.
Yes,
in the sense that clearly, if risks are complicated, we mentioned the nuclear power station, the chemical plant, then clearly the risk assessments need to be into some significant depth.
So that wouldn't be a page. No, for a nuclear power station, it wouldn't be a page. No.
Because clearly, obviously, they have to do safety. They have to do safety cases, which and justify everything they do in that respect. So that's sort of one extreme. Clearly, if you, again, go back to perhaps towards the other end, for most organisations, the basic guidance that HSE issue on the typical 5 steps to risk assessment, which is clearly what all risk assessments follow, but in terms of actually doing it, it shouldn't be a very complex, involved process. It's a matter of recording, identifying the control measures that are in place to deal with the well-known hazards the organisation has, and as I said, and to make a decision is, are those control measures adequate? Are they working? And if not, what additions do we have to introduce? It has to be a review process as well, of course, so to ensure that the risk assessment remains valid. But for the vast majority of organisations, it shouldn't be a full-time job, put it bluntly. It's something that you can visit, on a reasonably regular basis, ideally, but it's not something that's going to need the resource of a full-time person. It's a matter of, just really putting down the key issues that impact on the organisation and what the organisation does to address them. So
I certainly always think that's a good starting point. If you start off with a sort of a broad brush approach to start with, less complicated, you can always dial it up, can't you, if you need to go to more complexity, like in a nuclear power station. But obviously you don't want to start off with that. It's out of the proportionality. I think it's an interesting thing, Holly, about Dave mentioned about guidance and credible guidance. So is maybe a lot of risk assessment, maybe if there's such a lot of guidance out there, is it a case of a gap analysis almost?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the best place to start, but I guess it will also depend on how seriously your organisation's attitude to it, as we discussed previously.
Yes.
If your organisation puts a lot of weight behind health and safety, perhaps that is for reputational reasons. They think it makes a better business case for them when they're going for tenders and that type of thing. Then what's required of you in terms of risk assessment may be more in depth or involved than perhaps another organisation working in a different sector. But I think, yeah, the key, as the guy said before, really, it's around involving those who do the job in the risk assessment process to make sure that those risks are identified, and you don't assume that a job is being done in a particular way. You actually find out how it's being done, so that you know that any controls and things are put in place are relevant, and also take in mind the business context as well. So you know, if budgets are tight, that you're putting something forward which is an appropriate control method. If your organisation is particularly concerned about climate change, which I think a lot of organisations are, it's a big risk in the world, that anything you put forward is also taking into consideration the environmental impact on the organisation as well.
That's a really interesting point, because you're right. It's not just, you know, many of these risks are connected, aren't they? It's not just a health and safety angle or an environment angle or whatever. There are lots of connections, and that's what I like about the sort of holistic risk management approach. And in controlling one risk, you can end up introducing, you know, other things if you don't think more holistically. So that's
right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. I think one of the things that you see sometimes, ask this to Vicky really, is people concentrating a lot on things which are very unlikely to happen. This sort of fixation sometimes, and that leads to a lot of worry. So what advice would you give on that? How unlikely do you consider things?
I think, well, it's interesting, isn't it? I once worked with a company who there was an employee who was concerned that they were going to be attacked within the local area whilst leaving work, and when we looked at the you know, statistics around the area, the guidance that was available for lone working, and we started taking into account, you know, how did everybody else feel? Because actually, we're not going to just say, well, no, you're being ridiculous. It wasn't that at all. They had genuine concerns. So, but actually, we talk a lot, of course, as low as reasonably practicable. But of course, when we're doing that, you're weighing up the risk and the cost associated with it. And it was about then, like, finding control measures that actually weren't going to take a lot of time, weren't going to be really onerous, and weren't going to cost a lot of money, and get them to a point where actually they felt comfortable as well, because we can't dismiss it entirely. However, there are, of course, I have been to some places where they see I'm trying to think of an incredibly good example, which I can't off the top of my head, but they see a risk, but actually there's nothing we can do to control it. For, you know, it's and it's something that actually we can't get as low as reasonably practicable, because, you know, the risk will always exist. You know, and you have to, as much as you can, try and work with these people to get them to a point where they feel comfortable and confident in what they're doing. And actually, there's loads of case studies, evidence that it makes people more productive as well.
I think that's a really interesting point. It sort of relates a bit to Holly's point about attitude to risk, because if you're sort of overly risk averse and very, very sensitive about certain risks, you'll end up, you know, fixating on them and all of that kind of stuff. And I think it's Dave's point earlier about being kind of more objective about risk, and what we mentioned earlier about connecting it with guidance that's readily available and common sense that kind of helps bring it into reality, instead of thinking about an asteroid strike or this, you know, really rare things, but actually these are the common things that you would expect to take care of. I know we've had previous conversations, David, about you know, everyday risks that you might encounter, and in general, you know, you should be comfortable with that and not be overly doing. But I do know that you'd mentioned to me before about your duty is to individuals. So actually, vulnerable groups might be especially at risk. And I think you had an example, didn't you? What's your view on that? How, you know, with vulnerable groups?
Yeah, clearly in any risk assessment, you need to take account of the population who's exposed to those risks. And obviously in many organisations, certainly larger organisations, you're going to have people with possibly certain disabilities who normal control measures won't be sufficient to look after them. People with possibly who have epileptic fits, for example, or people who are hearing or visual impairments, and clearly, you know, there's a duty under the Equality Act, obviously, to take into account of those and to try and clearly increase employability within those sectors. So certainly looking at vulnerable people, what you need to address them and ensure that the control measures you've got in place for everybody else are sufficient for them as well. Otherwise, clearly, they're going to be at particular risk. And that could also lead to, you know, it is a difficult issue ultimately in some organisations, and with obviously clearly some people, as to in keeping somebody employed when their vulnerability is so high, and at what stage. And it's a very difficult decision organisations in some circumstances have to make. That if they can't keep somebody sufficiently safe, then or not find them another job, then there might ultimately be difficult then to maintain their employment. There's always a very difficult balance to maintain between sort of health and safety and equal opportunities and equality issues. And it is a bit of a tightrope for organisations that they have to think about very carefully.
I mean, there's a particular hazardous job, isn't it? Tightrope walking.
Yes.
You know, I mean, so what I'm hearing is you don't necessarily have to be an expert in, you know, unless obviously you're working in a very high hazard industry where you need very specialist knowledge, but really there's enough guidance out there and a bit of common sense to cater for a lot of things. Is that what we're saying, Holly? Maybe. I'm not leaving you to. Yeah.
No, I don't think you need to be an expert in everything. Obviously, as you've just said, high hazard environments are perhaps a little bit different, but you know, you don't know what you don't know, do you? So I think you do have to perhaps make an effort to talk to people to make sure that your own bias and assumptions are kept in check, and perhaps, as well as looking at the guidance, you're just talking to others in your network, attending conferences like this to get tips and techniques, and then you know when to seek out perhaps more specialised expertise at the appropriate point when you think you need it. And I think a good example of this is perhaps if you take Uber, which ultimately is a technology company. Over the years, it's had to give more attention to safety. And why it didn't do that from the beginning, I don't know. Maybe it wasn't seen as important. Maybe the founders didn't realise or didn't appreciate the safety risk. I'm not sure, but I think that's why it's important to kind of really talk to people and not make assumptions, and really kind of drill down on what you think the big risks are to your organisation. I can imagine like a technology company would perhaps focus on data and cyber risk, whereas actually, you know, safety for reputational reasons as much as any other is also an important issue to them.
I think that sort of connects with another topic with which again we've discussed several times before about the changing nature of risk, and that you do get emerging things that you didn't know before. I think you mentioned it about you don't know what you don't know, and this is the nature of it. I think both David and myself have worked in the chemical industry. That's some of our background, you know, and we're still alive, actually, aren't we, David? Despite all the chemicals we're exposed to. But we know, don't we, David, that what you know about chemicals changes. Yeah. So it's things that used to be considered safe, you know, aren't any longer, or at least you find out more about the ways they can kill you or hurt you or something. So I suppose that's where you might need a bit of more specialist knowledge. I think it's interesting, actually. I think obviously a popular way of doing risk assessment, certainly at the end of these risk matrices that people use. I mean, I've seen anything from a 3x3 matrix up to 100x100 matrix, which, you know, is that better? But perhaps not. I mean, I think you've got a view on this, haven't you, David? What do you think of these risk matrices?
Well, yeah, I'm sure for viewers anyway, if you consider a risk matrix as having two axes, it's sort of two variables that people try to make some sort of assessment of, which is the likelihood of an event happening, and if it does happen, the sort of consequence or range of consequences. There is no formula as such, you know, mathematical formula that says that risk equals likelihood times consequence. It just happens to be what, you know, as happens, you know, people seem to be the most comfortable with it. You know, some people would suggest that you put more bias on the consequence, and rather than having likelihood times consequence, you multiply up the consequence more than the likelihood. However, the point I would like to make is that estimating likelihood is great, good. You know, have a feeling for how often something's going to happen. If it's happened in the past, or is it likely to happen now? Have some sort of feeling for that, and it is as much of a feeling. And then consequence, clearly, most people, if they've identified the hazard, can have some sort of idea as to the sorts of harm it could occur. And it's a range of possible harm, isn't it? You know, depending on how fortunate or unfortunate the individual who has the incident is. So estimating likelihood and consequence is what we tend to do, and that's fine. Nothing wrong with that at all. The real bugbear I have with it is when people put numbers on them, which is not too bad, but then they combine these two useful pieces of information, likelihood and consequence, to give some sort of nebulous term called risk. And to give you an example, if people, I'm sure most people are familiar with the risk matrix. If you've got a low likelihood, low consequence event, then the risk, of course, is going to be low. No problem there. If it's high likelihood, high consequence, it's going to be a high risk. No problem there. Problems arise.
That would be 9 in my 3x3 matrix. Yeah. But if you have, what often then happens is you have events which are high likelihood but low consequence. That's like slips, trips and falls. And then the other extreme is something high consequence but low likelihood. You know, your chemical disaster, something like that. Yes.
What often the problem with the matrix when they're applied and people put these numbers on them and get this so-called risk value is that you start equating to totally different risks and giving them the same rating. So often, if we think of a high likelihood, low consequence, say as, 1 times 5, and then do the reverse, low likelihood, high consequence, you'd have a 5 times 1. And then you say they're both the same risks, and of course they're not. So I would never combine those two values, because you have two very useful pieces of information, and combining them to have some sort of nebulous risk term, I don't think is useful at all. Because when we come to identifying control measures, then you look to, well, how can we reduce the likelihood? Or how can we reduce the consequence? Whereas if you've just got a risk value, it's very difficult to say, well, what can we do about it? Because you have to come back to those terms. So the matrix itself, I think, confuses things and can often lead to unusual outcomes, which aren't very useful. So have those pieces of information and use them, and then use those rather than combining them. And that's sort of what, my bugbear when I see risk matrices.
No, that's it. That's really interesting, David. I hadn't seen that before about the way that people equate them. You're absolutely right, because they are very different kind of things, different causes, different kind of nature as well. That's interesting. Have you seen this sort of risk matrix use, Vicky, in particularly in your, I suppose you do a lot of fire type stuff, fire risk assessments?
Absolutely, and actually in fire community we don't tend to use risk matrix at all. You look at the hazard, but then we are only focusing on one hazard. So, and then you're going through and saying, is it tolerable, or we'll look at the likelihood of the harm occurring, and you come up with a conclusion for that one hazard. Because I think it was Holly who was saying earlier that you can end up with almost when you're doing multiple hazards in one go, it almost ends up being a bit of a gap analysis. Rather than it being, looking at every hazard and working out whether or not the risk, I think we call it a risk rating, or it is known as a risk rating. Whereas actually, if you did have something that is, the consequences are very severe, but the likelihood of it happening is once every 10 years, you still should concentrate on that as much as you would as something that's happening really regularly, but actually consequences are really low. And then we're into our accident. I'm going to say triangles, where you look at how many near misses and going up from there.
The bird triangle, something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And which is it's so key to try and look at all of these bits as separate areas, so that actually you can make a judgment on it. To decide, do we need to do more in the hierarchy of control and go a bit higher?
That's true. I think another thing that I've seen, certainly the risk matrices, is a tendency, like we sort of touched on earlier, is for people to decide what the risk magnitude is going to be to start with, and then sort of work out what the likelihood and consequence should be to make that. It's almost like they've decided already. So that's quite an interesting misuse of it. But also a related subject is this, which I know, Holly, you've got a view on, is this sort of dynamic risk assessment, how foreseeable things are, and how much you can do in advance, and therefore how much risk changes. So what's your view on dynamic risk assessment?
Well, it's not so much me, I guess, that has the view, but I've spoken to different members from IRSM who most find it useful for those situations that you can't always predict it exactly. But then we've had a couple of others who have found that perhaps sometimes people do a dynamic risk assessment in place of doing a full risk assessment. So I think we're just being really sort of clear about when it's appropriate to do a dynamic risk assessment and when it's not, and what the constraints are kind of around that, really.
I think that's interesting, because it's kind of, I get the impression you shouldn't be using it as an excuse for not thinking it through beforehand. But it's actually taking account of when you're on the ground, the situation is evolving, and therefore you can't predict everything. I think that it's often used in emergency situations, isn't it? I think, David, where you have sort of a worked out options, but actually you don't know until you turn up to the burning building or whatever what you're actually going to find. So that's a kind of, and I think I've seen it in things like school trips, outward bound centres as well. I suppose you must see it, Vicky, in sort of fire emergencies and things. This idea of
absolutely, and of course, you've got to. I mean, these people who are going out to these emergency situations are, that is what they've been trained to do, and it's when they pick up on something that is highly unusual or different to the norm, that actually they take a step back, judge it, and then decide what the best course of action is. Yeah, I mean, we're thinking about, obviously burning buildings. You've got to think about the structural integrity, and actually, if they realise that they've lost 3 walls, they're probably going to take a step back and think, well, hold on a minute, let's not put any personnel in it. But you wouldn't expect a policeman to be chasing somebody to then realise, well, hold on a minute, I'm going down a dark alley, let me stop and do a dynamic risk assessment. Most of the time, you're doing it in your head as you're going along. It's high risk, totally unexpected. We need to get something in place. For example, you're turning up to a place and you think that the gutter is going to be 2 stories. So actually, you just got to fix one bit of gutter. It's going to be less than 20 minutes on a ladder. You've got somebody footing it. You go up and then you turn up and you realise, no, it's a townhouse, and actually I'm going to end up 4 stories up. That needs to step back, and actually we need to look at what controls we can put in place, or what controls they can.
No, that's really interesting. Well, we've covered rather a lot in risk assessment. I think thank you very much for your input. I know you're all busy people, and well, maybe this is the only thing you do. I don't know, but this is made your day. I don't know. It's but actually, I expect you are busy people. I know you're busy people. So thank you very much for your time. Vicky, Holly, and David, and thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Good.
Cheers.